Okay, I said only a couple more videos of construction before we get to something more volleyball, and I got something more volleyball for you today. Today we are going to talk about sand. We need a lot of sand to fill our 5 courts, and we want to make sure that we buy the best sand that we can get for you all to play on. So downstairs we have samples of a bunch of different kinds of sand from across the country, all different sizes. And we also have a couple samples of what I will call West Coast gold standard beach volleyball sand. So we have some sand from Oregon. If you've ever played at the Seaside Beach Volleyball Tournament, that's the same sand. And I got some sand from Santa Cruz in California, which I hear is a pretty popular place. So we are gonna go downstairs and we're gonna geek out about sand. We're gonna look at how much dust we think is in there. We're gonna look at how big are the pieces of sand, how will they play underfoot, what's it gonna feel like when you go to jump to attack, is that sand gonna squish out of your way, or is it gonna provide a nice stable platform and base for you to get up and elevate and hit? We're even gonna put this stuff under a microscope and check to see, is it round and smooth, or is it more hard and angular? All of this is gonna help us decide what is the best sand that we can buy for this place. And I'm really excited to get going. Let's go downstairs and check out what we got. Come on. All right, we have some sand samples. Out of this set of sand, we are gonna choose what we put in this facility, but a couple of these are off limits. You can't buy Oregon beach sand. This is the stuff that comes from Seaside. You can't buy California Santa Cruz beach sand anymore either. They used to mine it off of the coast of California, but the Coastal Commission shut them down. Can't buy that anymore. But what you can buy is sand from Wisconsin. It's from the old shores of Lake Michigan. The number you see, 4070, that is basically the size of the particles of sand. The higher the number, the smaller the size. We got some Nebraska 4070. This is the stuff that you'll find in most of the facilities around Seattle right now. Nebraska 3050, it's a little chunkier, it's a little bit bigger grain. We'll show you some pictures of that grain in a minute. And we have Wisconsin 3050. This is a special blend that they made just for me. FedExed it over here so that we could test it out and take a look at it. All right, we got all these buckets opened up. Let's take a look at what the sand looks like on the inside. This is basically Seaside. It is really fine. Dusts off pretty easy. See if I can get in here, show you the size of this stuff. Let's check out Santa Cruz. It's that California Santa Cruz sand, a little different color. Maybe not as fine as Seaside. Comes off your hands a little bit cleaner. Get in here and see some of that sand, see some of those grains. This is that Wisconsin 4070 stuff. It's pretty light. It's got a really nice kind of golden yellow color to it. It looks pretty good. It's got a nice soft feel. Feels like it's a little bit more round. We're gonna get these things under the microscope too and take a look at what the grains look like. This is that Nebraska 4070. This should look familiar to anybody who's played inside recently. You all probably know what this feels like. Again, it feels pretty soft, feels pretty round. Not too much sticking to your skin there. Let's take a look there. And this is where we start getting up to the bigger stuff. This is Nebraska 3050. So this is going to be larger size of sand, and you can really feel the difference in texture. It feels more gritty. It almost sounds more gritty. It's pretty clean off your hands too. It's not too bad, but you can maybe can't quite tell from the video. We'll look at some photos later, but it's definitely bigger. And here's that Wisconsin 3050. That blend they made just for me. Stuff feels pretty good. It feels maybe a little bit more round than the Nebraska 3050. Cleans off your hands pretty good. All right, we'll take some quick pictures of these things so we can look a little bit closer in a still photo. And we're gonna get all these underneath a microscope also. Take a look at what they look like under a microscope. This Oregon beach sand is a classic Pacific Northwest beach sand. It's kind of a salt and pepper color, very soft, very smooth. And when you compare that to the Santa Cruz sand was visibly more coarse. About the same color profile, however, but it had a more grainy feel. When you compare that to the Wisconsin 4070, this stuff was really interesting. It was a very golden blonde color and also really consistent in terms of color. With a Nebraska 4070, same grain size, but it was much more salt and pepper. You could see the differences in dark and light material in here. The Nebraska 3050 was pretty similar to the Nebraska 4070, but again, visibly and noticeably more coarse and larger grains. And when you switch to the Wisconsin 3050, again, it was a little bit more blonde, a little bit more consistent in terms of color, but obviously more coarser. Stacking all this together, you can see the differences side by side with the Seaside, the Wisconsin, and the Nebraska sand compared to the Santa Cruz sand. What was perhaps most striking here was the difference in color. That Wisconsin sand was a much more consistent, much more golden sort of color compared to the more salt and pepper look that you got from either the Nebraska sand or the West Coast sand. All right. Now we have some idea of what the sand looks like. We have a little bit of an idea on how the sand feels, but we didn't really explain what those numbers that we talked about were. What does 4070 mean? What does 3050 mean? Well, that really is gauging the coarseness or the fineness of the sand. The higher the number, the finer the sand, the smaller the particles. Now they measure this by passing the sand through a set of sieves. Let's take a look at what that process looks like. Now I use the word sieves. That's just a fancy word for screens. We start with screens that are really large, something that's going to catch a rock, and they get progressively smaller and smaller, and as you filter sand through those screens, the larger particles are captured on top. And they get very, very fine, very small, so small that you can't really see through them. You have these apparatuses that will take the sand and you stack up these sieves in a big tower and you shake it until the largest particles stay on top and the smallest particles will fall all the way through the bottom. And this is the process that you use in laboratories to figure out your sand size. So for a 4070 sand, the majority of the sand is caught between the 40-sized sieve and the 70-sized sieve. Now, the first time I saw this, I didn't really know how to translate a sieve to size. It's not really straightforward. And so there are standard sizes for these sieves, and you can see that a 4070 sieve is smaller than 0.5 millimeter. Now, it's hard to really understand how small that actually is. So the best I can do is compare it to the size of a human hair. A human hair is about 75 micrometers. So we're really talking about sand that is about 3 to 5 times as wide as a single human hair. The size of the sand particle isn't really the only factor. How round and smooth versus how coarse and jagged the sand is makes a big difference on how it plays. It's either going to be angular, which is coarse and jagged, subangular, or round. So let's take a look at that. Now, intuitively, this kind of makes sense. You could have something that is sort of round, but very, very hard edges. It has like rough edges to it, and it feels really, really coarse. So this would be something that is high sphericity. It's sort of round, but it's very angular. It has hard edges to it. Versus something that is round and smooth at the same time, like maybe a basketball or a baseball, that's going to feel a lot softer. It's going to be well-rounded and at the same time highly spherical. Now, compare and contrast that to something that has low sphericity, something that is not really round. You could have something that is very angular. It feels really coarse and really gritty under your skin versus something that is still well-rounded and smooth, but not really spherical itself. You could imagine something that is very, very angular getting worked on by the ocean over the course of millennia and smoothed out into something that is well-rounded but has low sphericity. All of these things are going to feel a little bit different underfoot when you go to play on it. And in fact, you can actually buy charts to grade sand on its sphericity and its angularity. So now we have sand that is either coarse or fine, small or large. But what does this mean for beach volleyball? Well, we can take a look at what the AVP specifies for its sand. And it basically says that it wants sand that is somewhere between medium and fine, somewhere between 0.5 millimeter and 1/4 millimeter in particle size. Now, this doesn't really talk much about the angularity or the smoothness and roundness of the sand particles. So I went looking for some studies, and I was able to find a single study out of Poland that looked at multiple courts that were used by Polish teams training at the national and professional level, and evaluated those courts and the sand on those courts for things like the size of the sand grains, the angularity of the sand grains, and also evaluated players' opinions on how well those courts played. Now, I don't want to go too far in depth here. I'll link the research paper below if you're interested in reading it. But there was a single sand that jumped out to me that was really, really interesting. It evaluated super well on the court that enabled the most dynamic play, the court that people liked to play on the most, and the court that had the lowest amount of dust. This was the court at the University of Health and Sports Science. What was so good about the sand that was on this court? Well, this study actually looked at all of the sands on all of the courts really, really closely. So closely, they looked at it under a microscope. And you can see that this health and science court had sand that roughly looked like this. It was something that was maybe subangular to rounded to very rounded and had pretty small particle size. You can see from this picture from a microscope that the grain sizes are probably right around 0.5 millimeter or maybe even smaller than that. Now, it seemed that this sand really stood out in terms of player preference. Did this align with the conclusions of the study? Well, the study said that sand used for volleyball courts should be rounded and well sorted, and that even a small presence of coarse sand and gravel has a very negative effect on playing satisfaction. In simple English, you want a sand that is fine and smooth to play beach volleyball on. All right, based on that study, we have a rough idea of what we're looking for. We're looking for some sand that is maybe subangular to round, fine particle size, smaller particle size. Let's take a look at the sand samples that we have under a microscope and see if we have anything that matches. Now, we just so happen to have a microscope. We've had this thing kicking around since COVID times when we were doing science class at home. It's not the best microscope, but it's going to definitely be good enough for us to get some sand under it and take a look at how angular versus how rounded it is and relatively how large the particle sizes are across the different options that we have. So first up is that Oregon coast sand, something like Seaside. You can see it's pretty small and pretty rounded, maybe something that's subangular to rounded in terms of size. Santa Cruz sand, on the other hand, definitely visibly looks larger in terms of grain size, and again is going to be maybe edging a little bit closer to that subangular dimension. Now, the Nebraska 4070 both looks smaller than the Santa Cruz sand and looks more rounded. I'd put this more in the very rounded to sort of rounded category. Now, when you compare that to the Wisconsin 4070, the Wisconsin 4070 is definitely, in my opinion, more rounded. I'd definitely put this in the rounded sort of category. It's more rounded than the Nebraska. Looking at the Nebraska 3050, we would expect a larger grain size, and we do see a larger grain size. Again, we're looking at something that is maybe in the very rounded category of grains. Comparing this Nebraska 3050 to the Wisconsin 3050 is really, really interesting. The Wisconsin 3050, again, is obviously larger, but to my eye, this looks more rounded again, maybe even closer to well-rounded in comparison to the Nebraska. Putting these all side by side, you really get an idea of what the differences here are. You can see Seaside versus Santa Cruz, two actual natural beach sands, are a little bit different. Seaside's a little bit finer. Santa Cruz is going to be a little bit larger. The Wisconsin 4070 versus the Nebraska 4070. To me, the Wisconsin 4070 looks a little bit more round than the Nebraska. And this carries over into the 3050 as well. The 3050, to me, again, looks a little bit more round. The sizes are pretty comparable. Now, I tried to get a representative, maybe single grain capture of each of these sands. And again, this is pretty telling. You can see that the Wisconsin looks more rounded than the Nebraska. The Seaside is a little bit smaller than the Santa Cruz. This isn't just microscope level details, though. This really translated into a macroscopic feel. I noticed this when I first touched the sand and commented on the Wisconsin sand feeling a little bit more smooth and a little bit more rounded. It looks pretty good. It's got a nice soft feel. Feels like it's a little bit more round. So we saw from that study in Poland that players preferred the more fine, more rounded sand. And that really kind of leaves us with two options that we're looking at, the Nebraska 4070 and the Wisconsin 4070. Which of these two are closer to what we saw as the preferred court in Poland? Well, I think, in my opinion, that turns out to be closer to the Wisconsin 4070. Just because of both its grain size and its angularity. This wasn't the only finding from that study, however. The study talked about how dusty that the sand got and how players preferred lower dust content sand. So they talked about silt and detecting silt with that sieve analysis that we discussed earlier. Now, I might have a microscope, but I don't have the fancy science equipment to do these sieve tests to figure out how much silt or dust is left in the sand. But what I can do is a quick and dirty turbidity test where we put a little bit of sand in a bottle and fill that bottle up with water, and we shake it to see how much sand settles out of that water solution and how much material is left suspended in that water. Whatever's left suspended in that water, it's a pretty good bet that that stuff is going to be small enough to be dust. Now what I've done is I've gone and I've put all of the sand in bottles filled with water. And the idea is you shake these bottles up and you see how quickly that water settles out and how clear that water settles out. Stuff that falls to the bottom is heavy particles, pieces of sand. Stuff that's floating around on the water, that's gonna be your dust. Now all of these, with the exception of the new Wisconsin one that just came in today, and the other new Wisconsin one that just came in today, they've all been sitting around for 2 weeks. Last time I was in here shaking up these bottles was almost 2 weeks ago. So I want to show you a couple things about some of these sands. Let's take a quick look at the Nebraska sand. See that layer of like kind of brown sludge that's sitting on top of it? That's not sand. That's all the stuff that settled out of that bottle. We'll shake that thing up in a little bit and you'll take a look. This one here looks a little bit better. It is the Nebraska 4070. This California Santa Cruz beach sand, this was last shook up a couple weeks ago. Kind of get a feel for how clean and clear this is. Mother Nature's washed this one pretty good for a long time. And if you play beach volleyball out here in the Seattle area, you've probably heard about the Seaside Beach Tournament. This is the sand from the Seaside Beach Tournament. And this is what it looks like after you shake it up and let it sit for a couple of weeks. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna run through a few tests where I'm gonna shake each one of these up and we're gonna get to watch it settle and see what it looks like. And whatever's left floating around in that water kind of gives us a pretty good indication of the dust that we're going to have in the sand that we order. Let's check it out. All right, first up is the Oregon beach sand. Now again, we're gonna pick this bottle up, we're gonna shake it, we're gonna set it down, and we're gonna see how quickly the sand settles to the bottom and how clear the water is when we're done. Let's go. Let's try it out. Give it a good shake, make sure everything's mixed up. Watch that settle. The water comes out pretty clear. That looks pretty good. Let's check the next one. All right, let's check the California Santa Cruz beach sand. This is the stuff that play on down in California. See how quickly this clears. It's pretty quick, a little dusty. All right, now we come to the stuff from Wisconsin, mined off of what used to be the shores of Lake Michigan a long time ago. Let's see how clean this stuff is. Give it a shake, put it down. What do we got? Oh, that was fast. That is fast and that looks pretty clear. That stuff looks pretty good. All right, this next stuff comes out of Nebraska. And this is the sand that you're starting to see a lot, at least in the Seattle area, for the courts that are being built indoors. Let's give this stuff a shake and see how it clears, how fast. See what we got. It's kind of taken a while. I don't know if you can see it or not, but the sand is settled out of it, but that water is not very clean. Looks to me like there's a lot of really fine particulate, a lot of really fine material in this sand that is not heavy enough to settle out. It's probably a lot of the dust. The next one also comes from Nebraska. It's gonna be a 3050, and this is the one that we took a really close look at. You can kind of see, like in here, a little layer of some sort of sediment almost on top of the sand after that water is settled out for a couple of weeks. Let's give this one a shake and see what we get. Huh, interesting. Same sort of thing, man. The sand settled really fast. The particles are a lot bigger. They fell out of the water a lot quicker, but we're left with sort of that really cloudy looking water again. And it looks again like a lot of material is just suspended in that water right now. And that's probably what that sort of murky looking layer was on top of the sand that had settled out after sitting around for a couple of weeks. So the last one that we're going to take a look at, let's check our last batch here. This is another batch that came from Wisconsin. I asked them to make this blend special for us. The word is the Olympics like to play on 30-50 blend. That's what I was told. I don't know, I haven't played in the Olympics before, so couldn't tell you for sure, but they don't make this blend right now. This is something that they had to put together special for us. They ship it here, and we're gonna give it a test here for the first time. This is kind of exciting. Let's see how quick this one clears out. Give it a good shake again. Put it down. And that settled out pretty fast. Looks like there's a little bit of dust in this one, maybe, just a bit, but not too bad. Let's walk back down the line now that we did that shake test, and we can kind of compare everything again one more time now that they've all been, mixed up really recently. All right, first off, we got that Wisconsin 3050. Let's come in here and take a look. It's not the clearest. It's not terrible. Here's the Nebraska 3050. That's been sitting around now for a couple of minutes. Kind of tell that water looks pretty dirty. Here's that Nebraska 4070. Again, this is that popular mix that you see in a lot of places in Seattle right now. Yeah, that water doesn't look very clear. Sand settled out all right, but it's pretty cloudy. And here is the Wisconsin 4070. It's that same particle size, same look and feel, but there's a big difference between those two. Real big difference on how clear that water looks. And of course, you compare it to some of the gold standard stuff, the California Santa Cruz beach sand. A little bit of dust in there, but not too bad. That settled out pretty quick. And same story with this Oregon beach sand. If you've been down there before, you know how fine the sand is on this beach, and it is pretty clear. It looks pretty good. So those are the options that we are considering. What would you pick? What sand do you want to play on? Is it that one? You want something a little coarser? Or you want to go more on the fine side? And I wish we could get trucks of that stuff. That stuff looks really good. All right, there you have it. I told you we were going to geek out over some sand. Now, we were able to look at some really great options from across the country and compare those options to sands from the coast of Oregon and from the coast of California. We even had a chance to look at a study from Poland that analyzed some courts that their professional teams train on and understand which of those courts the players preferred and why. We then took that information and looked at the sand options that we have to see which one was the closest match. Now, I want to say a huge thank you to our friends at United Volleyball Supply. They're the ones that have provided us with all of these amazing options, and they've really made the process of finding and ordering the best beach volleyball sand as simple and straightforward as possible. If you need volleyball supplies, or if you're looking to build your own sand courts, check them out at the address above, and I'll also put it in the comments below. So thank you again to United Volleyball Supply for all of your support. It's close to time for us to order our sand. What do you want to play on? What do you think we should pick? Let us know in the comments below what you think is the best option. I cannot wait to get this place filled with the absolute best beach volleyball sand and have you all in here playing soon. See you at the beach.